Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to panel 2, and this is Framing Reconciliation, Reparations, and Racial Justice in California and Beyond. As we build on what I think was an absolutely terrific first session on designing California's Racial Reconciliation and Reparations Commissions. My name is Brand Lum. I'm the provost at Menlo College, and along with Terry McKellen, we will be facilitating this discussion. Before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement as well. Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, consistent with our values of community and inclusion. We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. I also want to thank and acknowledge Stanford Law School's Gould Center for Conflict Resolution in conjunction with the Ohio State University's Divided Community Project, which I was proudly the first director of. I'm a little embarrassed to see how much good work is done since I and the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program for sponsoring this interactive symposium series. Thanks to the Stanford Law School Black Law Students Association for co-sponsoring, and very much want to thank Gould Center Director Jan Martinez for her leadership in hosting the first symposium in the series. I want to start by just, when I was thinking about that first panel, and I thought about what Eric McDonald was saying in terms of centuries of harm and centuries of repair, Kuzla's concern about what is even healing. I was thinking a lot about what the late Bishop Desmond Tutu said, which was superficial reconciliation can only bring superficial healing. And I think as we talk about framing, right, what I think the first panel really focused on what is it trying to achieve, and the ability to be successful is thinking about systems design, is thinking about framing here. So I do also want to recognize we have 5 distinguished panelists who are here. And by the way, they're not just panelists today, they're doing a much heavier lift of writing an article for the Ohio State Dispute Resolution, a double issue on rethinking systems design for racial justice and equality. Our plan is to give each of the panelists 3 to 5 minutes, and they'll present their initial response to panel 1, but very much through the lens of their own research. Carrie and I will ask follow-up questions, specifically on framing and systems design, and we'll have a short Q&A remarks and closing remarks. Now I'm going to turn over the floor to my co-moderator, Stanford Law School lecturer and research fellow, Terry McKellen, for his welcome and to tee up our panelists.
Grant, thank you. And thanks everybody for attending. There's a group here in person, and then there's many more virtually. And unlike the last panel, we'll be here all together. So it's great to be actually with people today and actually being able to have this conversation in person. Many of you are folks that we've been having conversations with virtually, so it's nice to have everybody here in one place. I thought I'd just sort of frame a little bit of the intention of this second panel in the context of not just what we heard immediately before, but also the 3-part series that we're doing. Again, this is all part of a wider collaboration with Ohio State's Dispute Resolution Program and Harvard's Conflict Resolution Program as well. And Ohio will be holding a large symposium on March 11th, and Harvard some days thereafter, and the website will be able to disclose all of that. The important thing about what we wanted to do today here at Stanford was recognize that we had a significant amount of work that was already happening, in part in the wake of the racial reckoning that was sparked in 2020, but more importantly as part of a long overdue historical exegesis that California's been trying to work through, whether it's at the state level, the local level, or even in other cities like Los Angeles and elsewhere. And so bringing that practical work here, now the journal's in a position and the academics are in a position to speak and connect that to their own research, connect that to initiatives that they've been a part of in other localities, and to think more broadly about some of the thematic and technical work that they've been looking at. So this is an opportunity to sort of be zoomed in the first panel in a deeply moving way. And this is an opportunity to zoom out and just look at these questions from other angles. I just wanted to introduce sort of our panelists here briefly. They can make a larger introduction of their work and whatnot. But we have Bill Froelich, who has been our colleague on organizing all these panels. He's representing a paper himself as the Langdon Fellow in Dispute Resolution from Ohio State. Sharon Press, who's the director of the Dispute Resolution Institute at the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law. Colin Rule, who'll be joining us shortly and is running just a bit late, is the CEO of Resourceful Internet Solutions, has been teaching at Stanford as well, and is just an innovator in ODR and the role of technology in dispute resolution. Srimranjit Singh, who's the managing director of the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at Pepperdine, Pepperdine's Caruso School of Law, and Dr. Ashley Vertruba, who's the faculty at the Law and Psychology program from the University of Nebraska. We're really grateful to have you all. And I think just to start, our opening question is really we'd love you to introduce your research and give us a summary of what you've been thinking about. I'd also love to hear from each of you through the lens of your research about something you heard from the first panel that really struck you and that you'd love to either build on or elaborate on. So we can just begin with Bill.
Well, thank you, Graham, Jan in our audience, and Carrie, and of course, Balsa for hosting us here today. And I also want to recognize and thank my colleagues at the Divided Community Project and Terry Murphy at the Mershon Center at Ohio State for giving me inspiration here this morning. My connection to this symposium focuses on an ongoing project, which captures oral history from a program called the Community Relations Service, which is a tiny little division of the Department of Justice that Grand used to lead under the Obama administration. Many of you in this call, and certainly on this panel, know that CRS provides mediation, facilitation, and conciliation services to communities in the face of crisis, from Selma, Alabama, to Ferguson, Missouri, and Stanford, Florida. CRS conciliators go into crisis. Often as the first federal responders, they work with elected, appointed, named, and unofficial leaders to identify emerging issues, reduce community tension, and keep residents safe. Not, as Fania Davis said, to replicate hierarchy, but to empower those in communities and to engage them in community conversations. They recognize that answers often lie within the community and hold space, which gives community members voice. They engage in shuttle diplomacy, formal mediation, facilitation, and systems design. They employ dispute resolution skills at the front lines of community crisis. When I traveled to Stanford earlier this week, I intended to highlight how the work of CRS conciliators might inform the work of truth and reconciliation commissions. But that doesn't quite meet the gravity, the moment of what we heard this morning. So instead, I want to share one part of one oral history that I'm working with my colleagues, which include Grand and Heidi Burgess in this oral history project. So I want to share one story from Ron Wakabayashi, or a metaphor, really. Ron is a former regional director from the West Coast. He's based in LA. And it's about the community relations service connection to truth, reconciliation, and justice. I know, Ron, that you're watching, and I hope to do you justice with this summary. With respect to CRS's intervention during a community crisis like the police-involved shooting, Wakabayashi notes the following. This is Ron's voice, and I'm sorry I'm going to read so I get it right. There's a tendency in the beginning stages of a major incident, like a police shooting, where the first voices out are demanding an arrest, demanding somebody to be fired. You know they're positional. It's understandable. It's human. People are hurt. They're angry. It takes some processing. Ron goes on to explain that conflict is natural. If you don't have pain, You would leave your hand on the stove and you'd lose your whole hand. It's a gift to have that pain, but it doesn't serve you once you take your hand away. You want the pain to go away. Take your hand off the stove. Let's dress the wound and move toward healing. Depending on how long you have your hand on the stove, you've got a different kind of repair to become involved with. Ron concludes this part of his oral history saying, "We didn't use the language of restorative justice and truth and reconciliation at CRS. But when those words started being used, a light bulb went off. Aha, that's the work that we've been doing." I hope Ron's metaphor meets this moment. We heard Don Tamaki say that we have willful amnesia in America. This is our hand on the back burner, sitting on the stove, simmering because of racial tension. CRS and its conciliators intervene when you feel the quick pain, the intense burn of the stove. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission style work that we heard from this morning, and I know the work we're going to hear Sharon talk about in just a minute, are designed to address the long burn of simmering legacies of slavery, racism, and discrimination. Their goals are parallel, but their means are distinct. The heat has been on for centuries, as Eric McDonald said, to take some of Eric McDonald's language. The hand of racism has been on the stove for a long time. I'll conclude with this quick observation. One day before the 10th anniversary of Trayvon Martin's tragic death in Stanford, Florida, the Community Relations Service, under Grand's leadership, was fully committed and engaged in Stanford, where the population of Stanford doubled as protesters. There were no arrests and no serious violence. Shortly after Trayvon's death, the city formed a Blue Ribbon Commission and developed a community-led 9-point plan. This week, when I spoke with Andrew Thomas, the city of Stanford's director of neighborhood engagement, he noted the work in Stanford is ongoing. 10 years later, Andrew and his colleagues continue the work towards healing, because healing in every situation is different, as we've heard from the colleagues in the prior panel. I just will conclude with the observation, or conclude with Eric McDonald's quote, "Centuries of harm should be met with centuries of redress." Thanks, Grant and Carrie.
So I also want to add my thanks to everyone, and this is actually the first in-person thing I've done in years. So it just feels so wonderful to be in community, and especially talking about things really that are so central to community, and really so inspired by that first panel and the work that's being done locally. So the project that I am working on is called Truth and Action, Addressing Systemic Racism in the Criminal Justice System in Minnesota. And we were very intentional in choosing the name Truth and Action and not framing it as truth and reconciliation or some other way of thinking about it. And I think that Anya Davis really gave the best explanation as to how we came to that without me actually having spoken to her about that. That it really is change that is needed, not to revert back, not to restore what has been, because let's face it, the criminal justice system has never been fair. It's never been appropriate. There's always been disparities. And so what we need is a break, a transition, a change, action to move away from it. So the idea behind this project is that it's system-wide. It's looking at system. And I really was very struck by the first panel and sort of a more comprehensive way of looking about all of the disparities across all of the different, from enslavement to housing, to education, to environment, to labor, to legal system. I mean, that is all true. And so in some ways, the project that I'm talking about takes a much more sort of narrower focus by looking at the criminal justice system. But intentionally looking at the criminal justice system as a system. There's been a lot of focus, especially after George Floyd was murdered, after him being in a long line of Black men being murdered, about looking at law enforcement. We felt like it was important, though, not to stop at law enforcement, but actually to look at the system as a whole. What happens when you get to the point of prosecutorial discretion? What happens at the courts? What happens in corrections? What happens at the point of re-entry? And does, in fact, what we suspect happen, that disparities that start absolutely in law enforcement just get compounded in each stage of the system, so that it is really problematic, not just at the beginning, but all the way through. The other sort of difference that I wanted to lift up that was really very aware of in listening to the various projects was the intentionality of being very focused. And so many of the projects that are local are looking specifically at the Black experience and reparations. And we decided that it was important to look across the entire BIPOC community, that there are disparities across all people of color, many of which that we are really unable to fully grasp because data collection is so poor at very many stages of it, including even how you know what somebody's racial ethnic background is, because clearly you can't rely just on looking at someone and saying, well, that's what it is. And there isn't really an opportunity for asking and having someone self-identify. The other piece that I wanted to sort of highlight into why do we call it truth and action was this notion, and very much consistent with what the first group was talking about, and I took lots of notes on, in terms of that truth telling and the story collection. The project really grew out of the notion that disparity exists. We know it exists. We have data that can show that it exists, and nothing has changed. Even though there have been, like small projects or individual connections, in a systemic way, nothing really has changed. And for me personally, I worked with the community after Philando Castile was killed. And there was a great deal of healing within that community and some really wonderful outcomes. But there we were 4 years later, and George Floyd was murdered. So it wasn't enough for us to work locally in communities and correct one-on-one issues. We needed something broader. And further, that we needed to have those stories to make the data come alive. And because it is only with it having a human face that someone can connect to, that we feel that will make the difference. As one of the speakers said, the most important thing is changing hearts and minds, that's the way to go about that. The last thing I'll say, because I know my couple of minutes is up, is that we also were really very struck by and very wanted to be guided and conscious of being trauma informed. That what we were going to be asking people to do was to relive trauma. And if we were going to ask people to do that, that we needed to be there to support. And so we have a counselor who is with us at every time that we ask for story collection to provide trauma first aid. We've got resources we want to be sensitive to. We are providing very, very minimal thank you to recognize that people are engaging with us in a way that is not easy. So with that, I am doubly inspired by what I heard this morning to continue the work and hope that we'll be more to explore some of the other challenges and other things around it.
Thank you. And I have to say, I think one of the things that we're all sort of trying to infuse into the American exegesis of these processes is how to institute that sort of breaking action, to create a moment where we really can put the past in one column that, as Fania mentioned, provide guarantees that those harms won't return. I also heard in what you're saying, the sense that the data isn't enough, and I think we'll all try to come back to talking about, you know, what the layers of truth are that we really are going to try to need to explore through this work, and how to look towards narrative change and other kinds of things. Grant, I'm going to leave you to the end just to honor your role as a moderator for a moment, and because I think what you have to say is going to tee up our next question. One thing I may ask just technologically, I think it's a little difficult for us to be heard, and if there's a way to turn up the mic, that would be terrific. And we may need to speak up a little bit more. I am using my lowest, least audible voice. So we're coming from Minnesota to Los Angeles now. I would love to hear more about your work and how that bears on what we just heard.
Okay, I'm going to be loud. If I'm
Please,
too loud, let
please
me
be
know.
loud.
As my name suggests, Sukhsimranjeet Singh, I was at least bicultural, I call multicultural. I grew up in India, and I've been now working in the US for past 17 years, and it's been a joy to learn more than one culture and work in two different cultures. So my passion has been cross-cultural dispute resolution. I've been teaching that subject for 17 years. And the questions that bother me or in my mind is, what is culture? How do we all see culture? Is there a bias when we see other cultures? Is there an impartial way of engaging with other cultures? And this morning's panel was fantastic to push us to think about cultures some of us have ignored. Cultures, for example, who are due $20 trillion, culture that have the land has been taken away from them, and treaties have been signed or not ratified. And this was wonderful to hear the conversation, but I think that's to all of us. Do we see our culture more? Do we see other people's culture more? Do we see our culture differently than other people's culture? Anyways, those are the questions that I've been working with. So I've written some on this subject. I've written on nuclear negotiations, the impact of culture. But lately, in the last 2 years, I've focused my work on access to justice and culture. It was fascinating. I spoke in Fordham Law School a couple of years ago before the pandemic, and then the pandemic took place. So I recently wrote a piece on access to justice and unearthing of the unequal access to justice because of the pandemic. So how the pandemic has helped us understand the power and displacement in our society, and how we are perceived, and how the actual power difference impacts the work. Even though we think dispute resolution balances power, does it? Is in our field. So that's some of my passion, and I've been really enjoying working in that field. But then I also am a practitioner. As many of the panelists here, I'm a mediator, I'm a facilitator. So I like to work in the field. So along with my amazing colleagues at the Strauss Institute, Professor Stephanie Blondell, you'll hear from her at Ohio State, Mr. Shafan Roberts from LA City Attorney's Office, a terrific colleague of mine, and then Peter Robinson and Sandy Joe, Assistant Chief of LAPD from the past. All of us were bonded together and created and worked on these trainings, these communication channels for law enforcement in LA, but not just stop there. We kind of designed for last 4 to 5 years a mechanism, a platform, a system, if you may, if I choose that term, where we can have a dialogue between law enforcement and community members. It was not easy. These conversations are very emotional from both sides. If you judging one side over the other right now, my request to you is stop. There is emotions on both sides. And that's the role of me as a mediator. I'm telling my mind, how can I be neutral, if I may? I know neutrality is not possible. Still, how can I be neutral and push the envelope in terms of understanding, empathizing with community members, both minority and not minority, and police officers who also belong to both minority communities and non. And as LA is very diverse, so there's a blessing for us who teach and work in Strauss Institute to work with that diverse population. So walking into that practice, we created something called Beyond the Dialogue series at the Institute. And we have invited what we call diversity fellows from around the nation. We just hosted Ms. Guzman, Jackie Guzman last week, my correction, this week, 2 days ago. We're traveling fast. And wonderful conversation about her book on neutrality trap, for example. So that's where the work is headed. Let me give you a couple of more pieces and then I'll go into deeper of any of these initiatives if you may ask further. But the question that was asked is pain. The question was discussed was healing. Is healing possible? And I love how my brother Bill talked about pain and it's good to have pain. And my comment on all of that is personally and with amazing colleagues from the Institute, I just don't want to give up. I want to understand the pain in the society. I want to understand why some law enforcement officers go the direction they do. And actually, I'm going to give you one data that some of you may not know of. I'm sure many of you do. Do you know there are police officers who get fired by one agency and they get hired by another agency? In fact, if you look at the recent killings, at least 2 of the killings were done of our Black brothers and sisters. 2 of the killings was done by officers who were fired by another law enforcement agency. And that data was shocking to me. It's like, how can that happen? Why aren't we doing enough? So this whole discussion about systematic or changing system designs is fascinating to me because we need to do some work. We need to do this communication peace building between different systems so that doesn't happen. My last comment is, it's just been a blessing to work with law enforcement overall as well. I've met some really genuine and men and women and heard their stories, including how the pandemic has made them rethink if their job is the right job to do. If you haven't had an opportunity to hear their stories, I welcome you to come join me in many of the communication listening sessions we do. And lastly, I need to mention, thanks to the grant by JAMS Foundation, we're going to continue that work for next 2 years at least.
Right. Thank you so much. There's lots to reflect on in terms of power. Mediating these conversations, not just internal to these processes, but then how we sort of politically socialize, publicize the results. Ashley, very excited to hear the work in rural communities.
Yes, thank you. And it is a pleasure to be here today, to be on this panel and to have learned from the first panel all the wonderful work that's being done in California. So the perspective that I come to this with is one as a social psychologist and then also as a mediator and a facilitator who currently works in Nebraska. And so a lot of the work that we think about and do, my colleague and I, Kristen Blakely and myself, really centers on these questions about how do we facilitate and have really difficult conversations around race in smaller rural communities and oftentimes communities that might be less diverse. And so we think about things like building trust in these communities. And as a psychologist and a social psychologist, I'm often very interested in how individual people interact with their environment. And oftentimes these processes are a type of social situation that we're putting people in. And as a mediator and a facilitator, I have a degree of control over those situations. And so how can I use information that we gain from the social sciences to inform how I construct and develop those processes? And so what Kristen and I have been working on is really trying to figure out what can we learn from social science? And then how can we take that information and distill it to a practitioner audience, whether it's facilitators, mediators in that context, and help them use this to build useful processes for having these difficult conversations about race. So an example of this, many of us understand and have learned that implicit biases are something that is inherent in American culture. They're there, but because they're implicit, we often are unaware of them. And they are incredibly pervasive, even among people who have really good intentions and who openly endorse equity. And so under what situations do those implicit biases impact these conversations? And then as a facilitator, how can I help improve the process to try to compensate for or overcome some of those types of biases. And so in some of my own work where this has come out is in resistance to certain types of conversations. Community groups who are trying to have conversations around reform, who are engaged and want to be there, but can be incredibly divided and often getting hung up on little things. And so as a facilitator, what do we need to do to try to progress those conversations forward and to get past those points that in the past, without official facilitation, have been breaking points in those conversations. So we consider that really with an eye towards what's the specific community that you're working in. So there might be histories associated with that community. And as a facilitator, you have to really get into the weeds and understand what the needs are of that community. And then how do you build these groups? How do you build decision-making process and so on?
There's already questions from the audience that circle around some of your work. Particularly, most of us, if not all of us here, to one degree or another, sitting in a community with the kinds of movements we need. I really appreciate it. Colin, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Sorry for the delay.
Not at all.
Managing technological channels.
Not
That's
a
a challenge.
Not at all. We're just at the opening still, hearing from people first about the research, but then also through that lens.
Sure.
Something from the original that struck them.
Absolutely. Well, the opening panel was great. It was very much of a piece with the article that Amy Oladeji and I worked on in terms of how we can use information and communications technology to more effectively design these processes and create options and avenues for participation. So, there's a lot. It's funny to be here sort of in the cradle of Silicon Valley. I know, Carrie, you've spent a lot of time talking with people about all the perspectives on the revolution, the technological revolution that sparked, largely right here. But I think we have a lot of examples of how that technology can be used at odds with what we understand about human psychology, but also at odds with our goal of building empathy and understanding. So what we were trying to do in our article was call out some of the techniques that I think could achieve many of the points that were discussed in the first panel. I think Zoom is a great tool, and it's amazing that we all use Zoom, but there's a lot of multi-party processes where people just open up a Zoom and everybody goes in there and it just becomes a mess.
And Colin, on that point, you could scoot in so you're seeing.
Oh, yeah.
That would help.
You gotta be on the camera.
You gotta be aware of the camera.
Hi, everybody. So yeah, I think maybe I'll leave it there, but I'm eager to see where the panel goes in terms of using, avoiding the sand traps that technology can generate, but also leveraging some of the new capabilities that it introduces to work that we talked about.
Grant, I think that turns to you. The article you're working on and the questions.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gary. So I've been working on an article with Sarah Cole and Nancy Rogers from the Ohio State Moores College of Law, very focused on framing, right? Which is also the sort of nice as the title of the panel as well. I thought about it in the first panel. I was trying to actually track what goals was I hearing from each of the earlier panelists, because that drives everything, right? What is the goal of your commission, of your task force? Because it then leads whatever strategies and actions you take. And the work that Jen and Carrie, you do around dispute systems design, that very much drives how you design your system. So, the goals were fascinating, right? So what did I hear? I certainly heard from Kuzla, correcting the historical record, addressing harm from Cheryl Davis, measuring harm from Eric McDonald, reimagining systems from Fania Davis, and which was interesting to hear from Cheryl when she was talking about California testing the idea of reparations. That was, to me, that was kind of interesting, right? It wasn't just like, this is what we're gonna do, let's test this idea. What do people really want, right? We heard that from a number of our panelists of, we can be at the table, but who are the people not at the table, and what do they really want for themselves, right? That's always been a power, I think, of those of us in the field that, dispute systems, conflict resolution in the 60s was created with the idea of bringing voices who were not in the courtroom to the table, right? Because we didn't know what they really wanted. I want to end with the two things that Don Tamaki said, two goals that he put out. The first thing he actually said was replicating this in other states, right? This is California was going to have the first one, and that would hopefully be a model for other states. But also then later in the conversation, he said, well, Congress is the one that needs to act because this is a national issue, right? So how can national learn as well? And he also said, which I think a few of us have noted as well, is the main goal, when at the very end, he said, changing hearts and minds. And that to me is really interesting because then framing does totally come into play, right? What do you actually, what do your reports look like? How does the commission operate? At a session that the Biocommunity Project did, I remember folks who are experts in commissions saying, the process is the outcome, that how you run your initiative is part of the success. It makes me think a little bit about, architecture. Function is form, right? I got that right. Function is form of how we design something, right? So, Nancy, Sarah, and I start our article by talking about the promise of an initiative, like what was the promise of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and 4 things were identified: the engagement of public officials, right? We're starting to, we got a little bit of feel for that there, but it's also the engagement of public officials with the citizens, with the people, with the residents as well. And then, of course, the second one was the ability to respond to a variety of goals. And Fania talked about it from a restorative justice standpoint, right? The R's, the remedy, remember, repair, and preventing reoccurrence. A lot of them can be sort of categorized. I think a lot of the goals can be categorized there. The third was that a single body can sequence, right? As we think about dispute systems design, and we think about very much the California task forces, they already have a 4-part system. They already have 13 chapters. I was thinking about what they're doing in part 2. They're really trying to think through, I think, all those things as well. And Eric McClellan actually referred to the 4th one, which is right now you're trying to leverage the current expanded support for racial justice. And of course, he mentioned that it's not going to last forever. and how do you? He actually brought up, I think, another goal, which is building civic will and also then political will as a result of that. So it was actually very interesting. I want to make sure we get the questions. I don't want to do too far, but they also talked about framing as well, right? We got to take into account that litigation will come, that we sit in a political context, whose voices get highlighted. That's all important as we think about how you frame this as well. So I will leave it there, and I will then ask Bill a question, since you're writing about conciliators, and we've heard from other folks, whether Ashley or Sukhsim Ranjit, about what mediators bring. I'm curious that you've been thinking a lot about conciliators, you think a lot about third parties. What's a role that third parties can play in these sort of initiatives, given all the goals that you've heard? Which ones might they conciliators be helpful with in these sort of initiatives?
Yeah, so there are 3 ideas that I have, and the first is as a third party neutral. There's something really interesting that the California Race Equity Commission has. They have a parliamentarian who manages some of the process, and if you watch the videos posted on the website, the parliamentarian plays a significant role in guiding with the process. And so that might take the heat off some of the commissioners because they don't have to make those process choices. They're often referred to. That's one that a third party role can play. Second is that a third party can try to work to connect and engage leaders who are trusted in the community. And you've heard Cheryl Davis talk about leadership in the community may not be named, right? And that's so often the case. We have informal mayors or gatekeepers in our communities, and leveraging those contexts, as Sharon has done, as clearly the folks on the prior panel are doing, can be so important. And that can be another role that a third party can help with, or provide ideas for how to connect third party support. One last idea that is drawn from some of the oral histories that I've collected is preparing parties to participate in a process. So I'm gonna give you a really quick story from a former regional director, Rosa Melendez, she used to work in the Pacific Northwest, from 2010, that she states in her oral history. So in August 2010, a Seattle police officer shot and killed a blind wood carver, John T. Williams. Regional Director Melendez described a tense initial conversation between 10 members of an indigenous community and 4 police officials. The conciliators worked to build trust, decrease tension, and give parties the opportunity to express anger and emotion. However, the depth of tension between indigenous communities and law enforcement was far deeper than Mr. Williams' tragic death. Ms. Melendez recalled one law enforcement representative who implied Mr. Williams could have communicated more effectively before his death with the police officer. The police leader proudly stated, "Some of our officers are trained in sign language." An indigenous representative responded quickly, "Our generation was not taught sign language in boarding schools." Melendez reflects on the value of preparing the parties for a process, preparing those who are engaged in the process with cultural expectations that Sixtimam was talking about earlier, with what the process is going to look like. She said, it's about knowing your audience. And in reflection, she could have done things to prepare the participants in that process more effectively.
Thanks, Lloyd. The first one of your 3 that you shared, first one makes a lot of sense, right? That way the commissioners don't have that pressure. That's the benefit of having the third parties. Like you're taking some of the heat in some ways away from folks who could be potentially targeted. I think the third one's really fascinating in terms of whether it's Ron Wakabayashi or Rosa Melendez, the ability to help people prepare to come to the table or to have the voice, because right, mediation often rewards those who are hyper, really love speaking and were hyper articulate and not in a certain format, right? They have to be very professional. Nobody speaks over each other and all that. So I think that's really useful. What was really impressive is that I didn't even give you that question beforehand. You had the 3 ready. If I could ask Colin one question.
Yeah, please.
So Colin, we've talked a lot about the use of online technology. There's such a suspicion around social media and the way that it polarizes people, right? It's out there all the time, the social dilemma and all of that. I'd be really curious to hear a little bit more about how you think technology can help in these sort of racial justice initiatives, especially in an environment where we're so suspicious and wary of it right now.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at how the big internet intermediaries have deployed technology to facilitate dialogue, it's sort of a masterclass in what not to do when you're trying to. And I think we addressed that in our article quite a bit. I think there's some baggage there. If you create an algorithm and you say maximize profit, it'll do some pretty destructive things. And I think when we talk about pulling out some of the best practices in the use of technology, it's quite different. And I was actually struck by what you were talking about with Bill, this whole notion of the parliamentarian. I think we oftentimes think that, well, getting everyone together in a room, we can all talk and we can engage. But Grant, you just said yourself too, that advantages certain personalities. The people that are more well-spoken or the more confident speaking in front of other people. But what technology can do is it can open many, many different avenues into the process, some of which may be text-based. One of the things we talk about in our article is people that can participate through art or other forms of expression. It might not be appropriate in sort of a traditional, group meeting where everybody's kind of sitting in a conference room. One of the reasons why I think dispute systems design and why I love the framing of this gathering, and I'm such a fan of Jan's book and all of the work there, is because the DSD people, they really get the value of technology. And we talk in ODR, we talk about the 4th party. Technology is another player at the table, between the disputants and the neutral facilitator or mediator. And I think there are some things that we can ask technology to do. We can make our process designs. First of all, we can deliver those process designs through a different mechanism that may be more participatory, it may be more democratic, it may be more transparent. But then also we can ask the 4th party to do some things that the 3rd party shouldn't do. Or maybe it would be putting too much power in the hands of one individual in terms of shaping the dialogue. So, we need to be open to the full toolbox of opportunities that technology presents us. We need to be very cognizant of some of the downsides and the pitfalls and the sand traps of the use of these tools, as have been well documented by a couple companies just a couple miles from here. But if we look at some of the people who are doing it well, I think we're going to find a way to leverage these tools to expand participation, expand legitimacy, and expand connection for all of the participants in the process.
It's interesting to think about. And Colin, when he refers to my work in Silicon Valley, I was an oral historian working on the great dislocations from rapid tech transformation in this area. And it's interesting to think about the ways that technology can increase access, increase conversation, increase greater equity. One of the struggles I heard in the private panel was this challenge of figuring out who should come to the table, how to create space for the voices that might not naturally be there. You heard that fundamentally from Gustav Kessler-Mata on the California Truth and Healing Council, just which tribes can even be included in the conversation. But then both specifically and obliquely, you heard from the San Francisco representation, the idea that the current public forums are challenging their ability to not just have the loudest conversation, the loudest voices in the room dominate the conversation, even in a public conversation. That's, I think, why we're hearing so much about community engagement, about listening circles, around oral history being a fundamental tool for the work. It'd be great to hear from those of you who want to weigh in more about how to frame or to bring techniques and design to improve equity in these kinds of conversations, particularly to make sure that the community has the leverage over the process that they should. And that community is defined in such a way as to create a really healthy and balanced even. And I will just say again, I am probably committing this fault myself. We still need to be louder than we are for the microphone, according to so pardon my apologies, but also
I mean, I'll talk a little bit about, from our perspective, and I think that it's, and please tell me if I'm not being loud enough. I have a loud voice.
They will tell me you're loud enough.
Okay, so that I think it requires being super intentional about this question of community engagement in these kinds of projects. That it isn't enough just to sort of put it out there, that one has to really think about what is it that is going to bring the community forward. And I will be honest about the challenge also of sort of finding the right space in terms of what is it that I and my colleague, my co-convener, Kitty Atkins, what are we doing as conveners? We are two white women, and we have to own that and be very aware of that. And we're doing a project that is intentionally about disparities involving Black, Indigenous, people of color. And that does not mean, or that means that we don't have inherent connection, relationship to be doing this work. And that means that we have been and continue to be very, very intentional about, in our role as convening, that we're not out in front, that we are doing it in community, that we've created a very, very large advisory group, specifically because we wanted broad representation of people who have been impacted by the justice system, people who are in positions where they can make change in the justice system, and then in all of the different aspects and all across all of the different communities. So you end up with quite a large group. And then to really lean into having people be those trusted intermediaries. How do they make connections and relationships and introductions and warm handoffs, and so that we build those relationships really both consciously and intentionally, but also and really walking this process over the long haul. I'll just add one other piece, and that is, it takes time. And that was something that I was not nearly as prepared for how long to anticipate. And part of this is this recognition of intentionally building relationships to be able to move forward.
Thank you. One of the moments that struck me most in the panel was Eric reflecting on the sort of tragedy of the cycle of the traumatized having to sort of relive their trauma, explain their trauma, be present in their trauma again in order to plead for repair for the trauma. And then there were hints of ideas about either in a listening posture or community, the ways folks outside the community, the white community in particular, could play a role in carrying that burden more important. And I'll begin with you, Ashley, just because I think you've been really engaged on this question of how to bring the white community into the conversation, particularly those who are sort of not necessarily tuned to be in community with this work. How do you get them to the table and bring them to be stakeholders equivalently?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question, and I think I'll bring in some conversation from Bill and Sharon, as I've already stated. You know, it seems that in my experience, when we're trying to bring people to the table, oftentimes they care about the broader topic, but they don't know how to engage or how to properly engage. And so there'll be a layer of resistance, or there'll be a layer of non-participation that comes out of that. And as a facilitator and a convener, that opportunity to kind of work together to set the goals and the structure for a particular process can be really beneficial. Using an example from a personal experience, we had a convener who had set up a group with a particular structure that involved a co-chair, or sorry, a chair and a second chair. And we had two really polarized groups on this topic. And we knew we needed to bring them together, or else one of the groups was willing just to sit back and listen. They weren't going to participate in that process. And so working with the convener to change that structure so that we could bring co-chairs together with equal power, equal status, equal footing to then engage, and the two of them modeling and demonstrating what that collaborative discussion might look like for the rest of the group is really beneficial in terms of bringing people in. I think it really helped that dialogue and bringing people together as a community who was concerned about an issue but didn't necessarily feel comfortable in this conversation.
Can I say a couple?
Please.
I'm going to comment on that. And Sharon, your point about community engagement, both of you made great points, especially thank you for raising the point, being white woman or white person of color. How do you bring in other communities? And one thing that was very interesting to me is, I don't have all the answers, but I have many questions. One question I have is, have we studied, and maybe Colin, you walk in here with our online expert, we're giving you that tag, so you can. And that is, have we studied how some of us who look different, we have different clothing, or a color reminds of us who we are, even though we want to forget we are minority, we are reminded constantly we are minority. How are we perceived on a camera, especially when we are doing this community engagements online, when we see the first thing on a screen is ourselves? And that's a constant reminder, oh, I'm a black man, I'm a turban man with a beard among 20 other people, and none of them look like me. And the question is, when you repeat trauma, the earlier Koslas made a great point about repetition. Well, are we studying? Is that reminding us of anything? Why am I the only one that looks like this on the screen? And I'm not saying this because it's just me. I was doing a facilitation in Salt Lake City with police officers and city government officials with my brother Shafin Roberts. And Shafin is a black man, and I'm a golden rustic brown man. And we both got together and did this exercise. It was very interesting. In one session, we had 4 men who were white, all the cameras were on. We had 3 men who were black, the cameras were off. And we had to figure this out. I'm not making any claims that I know the answers to any of this, but I'm just raising some questions. It's easy to say, let's bring community in. The question is, what community? How do we dignify them? How do we give them respect? How do we make them feel inclusive in a process that may not be designed for them to feel comfortable to begin with? And Colin has all the answers.
Well, I do, we have to move to the metaverse and we can all create avatars and then you can do whatever you like, we can interact with, I think it's a very interesting point. I will say, having done online dispute resolution now for 20 years, I never imagined that we would have the dominance of video that we have now. I mean, it's amazing what's happened during the pandemic. This unblinking eye of the camera that we spend all of our time. We're all kind of mini broadcasters. And I think that there is, I guarantee there's a lot more work to be done, understanding how the Brady Bunch of the video screen is affecting how we interact with each other and how we connect and how we negotiate and how we engage in empathy. I will say it's very interesting having worked at eBay and PayPal, and this was an ongoing conversation. At eBay and PayPal, we didn't have video. You never saw the video. You never even saw the name of your counterpart. You saw their eBay ID and you saw their reputation, but you never knew their age. You never knew their gender. You never knew if they had an accent. You never knew. And it was up to each party to decide what they decided to put forward. And I think online identity is, we have more control over. In a face-to-face interaction, we have almost no control. I mean, you all are looking at me and you're thinking, wow, this is a nerdy looking guy. Like what can I do? I'm a nerd. I've been a nerd my whole life. I can't do anything about it. But I'm just saying these implicit biases, we almost talk as if implicit bias, well, there's nothing you can do. I mean, it's built into who humans are. But one of the reasons why I think it's interesting, the younger generation is self-selecting to use a lot more online channels for communication, is they feel like they have more control over their identity. And a lot of the schools, when they started out, they said everybody has to keep their camera on. And some of the kids were saying, you know what, I'm not comfortable being on camera. I don't like this unblinking eye looking at me all the time. It makes me uncomfortable. I want to turn the camera off. So I think that there are some very deep questions about how this technology is going to change who we are and what control we have over the way that we present to the world. And I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying that this is a dynamic that we all need to think about. There was one other comment that I wanted to make before I hand back the comment, as they say. One of the things that I heard this morning that really got me thinking, and even through writing this article with Amy and Oladeji, I was thinking about these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as sort of an event or a process. Like, we're going to do this, maybe it takes a year, maybe it takes 2 years, but it's a process and it has an end. And the comment that really got me thinking was, we have centuries of harm, and it's going to take centuries of repair to address those centuries of harm. And what that made me realize is, this is not an event that we're designing. This is not a process that goes for 6 months and then we deliver a final report and then, okay, we're all better. We need to have a culture change. We need to have a change in all the processes we use to administer our interactions with each other, to build systems that are more fundamentally empathetic. And I do feel like technology gives us that opportunity to design these new systems. And we don't have to do things the way that we used to do them, because the way we used to do them created a lot of the issues that generated the harm. So I think that, to me, it makes me want to go back and rewrite the article. I'm sure Oladeji and Amy wouldn't be happy to hear me say that, but I mean, again, this is an event we're designing over 2 years. This is a new culture that we're building, and we have to think about it that way. And I think that the impact that technology is having on the way our society operates, that's an opportunity for us to build new systems that can maybe deliver that century of repair.
Yeah, to me, it's not an either or, right? And that's online versus IRL. But in real life, there's combination, right? The internet has allowed me to connect with people that I would have stayed in contact with from high school. And I was thinking,
For better or for worse.
For better or for worse, yes. So there was a comment that in preparation Bill made to me about them thinking about how CRS conciliators, they knew who the informal power structure was, like the people who aren't at the table, who might be the local mayor of the neighborhood. Thomas Battles, who's a former CRS conciliator who works with us at the Ohio State Bridge Project, was always wonderful knowing who to really understand what was going on in the community, right? So there's a type of combination. Actually, it made me think about a question I'd love to ask Sharon, which is, you said, hey, we're going to go beyond just the Black experience in Minnesota to other BIPOC people. And it certainly came up where there was a focus for it. And when you're measuring harm, it's easier when you get to a more discrete, here's the harm and here's the remedy. I think there's some challenges too when you've reached out to that broad, that broad an audience, right? In California, we didn't even talk about, right? We talked about the Native experience and Black experience, but there are many other, the Mexican American experience and the Chinese experience. There's some struggles there too. We know that. So I'm gonna be clear, Sharon. Has that been a challenge too?
I think it's a challenge, and I don't know how you look at the criminal justice system and you only look at a segment of where those disparities exist. I think it's really important to understand if and again, back to I was reflecting on your question around framing and goals, and so for us, the clear goal is systemic change. And if that's the goal, then I don't think you can say we only look at one community. I think we have to say we have to look at what's the system doing across the system, and then make sure that the change that is sought, the action taken, addresses the change that's needed. So yes, I think we bit off a lot. We thought that we were, by saying, okay, we're not going to look at education and healthcare and, all of the other kinds of disparities that exist, and just focus on the criminal justice system, that was going to be okay. And we also did a smaller geographic area than all of Minnesota. We said the Twin Cities. And I go in the article a little bit about how that's even a challenge to describing what that is. But it will be a challenge, but I think it was the necessary goal.
I have a question for you and everybody else, but specifically on framing, which is one of the things that came up as a struggle in the prior panel was this question of there just layers of repair that people have already acknowledged need to be addressed that are coming up in community conversations. One of them is policy reform. One of them is systemic change. One of them is remuneration. There's a number, a dollar figure that has been robbed and needs to be restored. Another is narrative change. Another is trauma healing. How in programs that are this ambitious, that want to tackle so many different layers of goals, how can framing be managed successfully? Does it need to be renewed continually? Do each of those things need to be bit off at different points? What are ways to sort of master what I think was raised as a sort of civic, a civic momentum project that needs to be part of continually the work.
Really hard question.
Yes, which is why everybody should chime in.
Tanya referred to the South African Truth Reconciliation Mission and talked about some of the challenges, right? Because it was both, in my perspective, it was both incredibly successful and yet, didn't accomplish certain things as well. And to me, but aren't we all? I would say, fundamentally, it did so many amazing things, right? In terms of remembering, in terms of repair. My sense is the more we can be, I'm not sure transparent is the right word, but very explicit with what we're trying to achieve, and it's a constant revisiting of that, and to have people. I think a lot about Eric McCloud, a lot of it is, and having worked in the political world, it is really having those lenses there. The political lens, I'm not sure we've talked enough about. It's huge in terms of what's realistic, what people will do. The one thing I referred to from the article that Nancy and Sarah and I are working on is we saw the Charleston, South Carolina. They were trying to start an equity commission, and to watch the hearing on Zoom that they did is to then hear those conflicts of we need to talk about what's true. We need to see who's with us and who's against us, and someone else raising the issue within that is saying, but I'm concerned, I agree with you, but I don't know what's gonna pass through the city council. And it's really amazing conversations. And what Eric said in the first panel is like, it came to be true. They actually had to change what the commission's goal was, and they were prevented from doing things like critical race theory and such in order to pass. And now, is that a good outcome or a bad outcome? I'm not sure. But let's being incredibly explicit and then being very aware of the politics of it, and then saying, what can we really accomplish? I think is incredibly important.
Could I follow up on that really quickly? One of the great parts about the Charleston Commission you referred to is their hearings are all on YouTube, right, for the public to view. Same with the California Indigenous Commission established by the governor, the Peace Equity Commission in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, small town, and the New York City Charter Review or Racial Justice Commission. One of the things that happened in New York City, they had about 9 months to come up with recommendations to change their foundational document, their city's constitution, the city's charter, to address race equity issues in the community. At the very beginning of that process, back in April of 2021, there were dynamic discussions about what the scope, about what the mission, about what equity means. And Graham, getting that explicit statement of what their mission, what they could and could not do, that they couldn't change every policy in every department through the Charter Review Commission, but perhaps they could do that down the road using other means. That's how you get maybe to those layers of repair and build on what these commissions can do based on their statutory authority, because many of them are established by legislative and executive orders. What's so amazing and fascinating about Sharon's work is that they have more flexibility than what's in a statute. And that is probably both a benefit and a burden at times. But I'll stop there because I know others want to chime in.
Just a quick, I think Bill knows my article better than I do. But I think it goes to the heart of your question. It's a wonderful report. You should look at the New York City report that was just done in 2021. But they end with 3 resolutions. One is to change the preamble, but that allows for more to be done in the future. And it's very sort of what will benefit all New Yorkers, no matter what your background is. The second is to create the Equity Commission, and these are all going to come in front of the voters in November in New York. And the third is let's look at actually what the cost of living is, which is actually a pretty fascinating one as well. But they're biting off what they think they can accomplish, and as you know, being from New York, it's never easy as well. But I think that's a really good point.
Cheryl Grills brought a point about restoration and repair right in the morning, and I was wondering we should have at least a comment on engagement and re-engagement. I think it's easily said to heal hearts and minds, but we all know it takes time. In India, it is said time has an inbuilt healing power. There's power in time to change, but only if people are motivated. So one thing we should also talk about is what if people give up? What if people are not motivated? What if a centuries or 2 centuries of same action, reaction, same racism we see again and again discourages us? And to the point of engagement and re-engagement is the point I have. And how do we help people not to give up?
Just so you guys know, I've been folding some of the audience
Oh,
questions into this, so it's not as if they're going into, I'm trying to frame them in a way that everybody can respond to. But we are nearing our time, and I wanted to give everybody an opportunity for some final thoughts. And I wanted to pick up on your theme of time and Bill, your theme of future and down the road, what the work looks like after these commissions are done. Many of them have deadlines. Many of them have reports that they'll issue. The work all continues after that. It was great to hear from you all. Just some final thoughts around the idea of what follows and what we all can do after that.
Do you have an order in which you want?
I do not, but we could begin in reverse and start with the future.
Okay, yeah, whatever I mind. I guess I do want to emphasize that I want to think big of the design of these things. This forum has made me think much more expansively about how long this process is going to take, and being artificially focused on an endpoint or a resolution. I think one of the challenges we have in the conflict resolution field is we talk about resolution, but it's much more about management and evolution. And I think that's so. I think thinking about things in terms of changing the processes, changing the culture, and building new institutions, that's exciting to me. I think there's more power there than just an individual system.
I think one of the things that has stood out to me today and in conversations I've had with several people here is the central role of building relationship and developing trust in these processes with individual people. So even though we're talking about systems and big ideas in the future and moving forward, I think a lot of that comes down to individual interactions and what it takes to develop trust. And trust is defined, in my world as somebody being willing to be vulnerable to a process or be vulnerable to a situation or another person. And so really, to what extent can we emphasize building spaces where we can trust each other and have that time together to do something, to be creative and generate ideas and move forward.
Thank you. It's a difficult one. I quick thought would be that policy change is needed and power plays a role. And I believe what we have captured this morning in this session is this idea as well of grassroots work, which is culturally influenced and is different in LA than San Francisco than Minnesota. And we can all learn from each other, and we need more people to join this movement.
So this question of time is one that has been central to my thinking about it. In fact, I start my article with a quote from Gail Werbach, who was one of the commissioners in the Maine Wabanaki Child Welfare Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I have it actually taped on my computer because it's my constant reminder on this time thing. And there's her quote. I think the biggest challenge is that white people, we want to go faster, fix faster, feel better faster. That's just not how historical trauma works. So any cities or communities looking at similar kinds of commissions need to take a long view time frame in anything they set up and not get trapped into thinking people will be reconciled and move on. It's been 500 years. And that to me is my mantra on this. And I end the article with, until this work is done, we can't stop. And we're not done. We're in no way even close. We are at the beginning of this journey. And it will take time. And I finally, I think, have reconciled myself to, I'm in it for the long haul.
Thank you, Sharon. First, on March 11th and April 8th, you could come to parts 2 and 3 of the symposium series at Ohio State and HMCP. There's links on the website. I just want to highlight, because oh, great. The panel this morning, the first panel was so dynamic. And there will be a similar panel. I don't know how it can compare to what took place this morning with leaders from the South Carolina Commission, the Carlisle, Pennsylvania Commission, one of Sharon's colleagues, as well as someone who worked on a TRC working group in Minneapolis as well, which is a city-initiated process, not a TRC, but a design working group. So I just want to highlight that for everyone who's participating today. But time, as I mentioned in my first comment, tomorrow is the 10-year anniversary of Trayvon Martin's tragic death in Stanford, Florida. There's still work to be done in Stanford, Florida. There's centuries of work ahead after centuries of racism. The Canadian Commission, TRC, 7 years of work, right? I think I might be getting that number off by a year or two, but it took a long time to do that work. So perhaps while these commissions are engaged, particularly those that are government connected, they can be taking steps informally to encourage and enhance policies, enhance work in their communities to build trust. But this is going to take time. And I hope everyone who's with us today takes one step in their own lives to help advance race and race equity.
Before I returned to Stanford and we practice overseas in transitional justice work in post-conflict circumstances. And coming home, it always struck me the degree to which so much of the conversation about race neglected the depth of harm and the time that it would take to repair what this country what communities in this country experience. We are at a moment where in so many ways, not just in this column, America's sort of a humble country that has lots of lessons to learn from other places. And I'm excited about the ways in which part 2 and 3 of your conference are going to be able to bring some of that conversation in as well. San Francisco is a unique place, and I just want to celebrate again the panel from this morning and sort of thank everybody who participated and joined us virtually and joined us in the audience. It's a city that has a tremendous history of diversity and also a tremendous history of conflict. And because of its position geographically, its position historically, and its position socially and politically, it's borne burdens on behalf of the rest of the nation that others haven't. I think there's genuinely groundbreaking work happening in the States, and genuinely groundbreaking work happening in the city, and genuinely groundbreaking people who are leading that effort. And if today is about anything, it's about all of us making some kind of commitment in tremendous long term on behalf of places like San Francisco that are changing rapidly and are sort of leaning into that change. That we shouldn't just be here for this brief moment while the work is trying to produce a report. We need to be there afterwards and be part of the innovation subject for that. I have little to add other than I'll add some brief thanks here that just to say some names out loud. Hideo Dunsi and the leaders from the Black Law Students Association, Bill Froelich and Carl Smallwood have been our colleagues at Ohio who've really made this opportunity possible. Sarah Delito Budish and Neil McGarrahan. Neil, I've only said your first name in life, so pardon me. And I think again a huge thanks to Jan, who leads our Gould Center for Conflict Resolution, and all she's taken on to me. And so let's celebrate Justin for his moderation of the earlier panel. Thank you all for joining. Graham, I will conclude us today, but it's been an honor to meet you all.
Thank you, Carrie. As a native San Franciscan, I very much appreciate your writing and your work. Honestly, I mean, it's inspiring to me. Since you gave a lot of things, that's great, but I do want to personally thank all the panelists. It's been a real privilege, and it was amazing to have that first panel. Well, certainly thanks to all the sponsors here and to everyone else. The one thing I would end is I was thinking about, we're talking a lot about history, we're talking a lot about the past. I've always heard historians say this, that when you talk about the past, you're really talking about the present. That you really are talking about today, right? How we think about history. And I recently was working with some folks who are leaders across the political spectrum. And one of the biggest issues that came up was, what is our American story? And what is our narrative? We see it with this discussion about critical race theory, what's being taught in our schools. Our ability to deal with this issue is fundamental to our country's future and our present. If we do not handle this well, we are going to fail, I think, as a country. This is our big challenge, and this work, I think, is critical and key to it. I want to end with one quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Thich Nhat Hanh, who just passed away this year. Kept things very simple. I love this about him. He said, "The practice of peace and reconciliation is one of the most vital of human actions." So I'll leave it there. So thank you all very much.